probably going to ramble, and I'm really, really sorry. I'm going to do my best to be like all academic and shit, but word bar.
Yeah, swearing. Woo!
Okay, yeah, but hey, there's going to be naked dolls on the screen. Ow! Ow! So, this is the presentation of my thesis. I finally, after 3 years, finished writing my thesis.
3.5.
My defense is 2 weeks from today. So this is actually, I'll be really honest, the first time I've revisited this document that I wrote since I handed it in to my committee. I've left it for a couple of weeks and I've just kind of ignored it, and then I picked it up today and I thought, I gotta put something together for it tonight. This is called New Capitalization on Old Music, Approaches to the Use of Opera Music in Television Advertising. This whole concept, this whole thesis began as a pet project of mine several years ago when I was still in high school. And our high school choir grew up in Vancouver, and our high school choir had an opportunity to be part of the Vancouver Opera in the Schools program. And I was like 16 and naive, and this opera singer came in, and she was singing all this great music, and she had an accompanist with her, a collaborative pianist. My apologies. That's right. She had a collaborative pianist with her. She had, and then there's some people, other people from the opera. There were 3 or 4 singers. They're doing their thing, and I think we were all really shocked. We were all really surprised because none of these singers were fat. None of them were tall, blonde women with horns and spears and doing that whole thing. In fact, the girl that I was, most enthralled by was this very young, petite, brunette girl with this amazing lyric soprano voice. And anybody who knows anything about, the Wagnerian opera and then the lyric opera, they're 2 completely different voices. And I was really, really surprised by that. And here she was, and she started singing. And she and one of the other singers sang Delibes' Flower Duet. And I'm sitting there going, at 16 years old, well, why are they singing the British Airways theme? Right? Because you guys remember back in the 90s, the British Airways theme was the Flower Duet. And that was when somebody pointed out to us, no, this was an opera first. And now it's being used to sell stuff. And that's where all of this kind of started ticking in my mind. So it's really been a fixation. The idea of opera and advertising has been a fixation of mine ever since. So now, 15 years later, I'm still looking at it. And I feel really, really blessed that I've been given the opportunity to kind of run with this. In my undergrad, I was told that there was no academic merit in this. So now I'm really happy that there is, that I found it. So obviously, this is something that it's a project I've been thinking about for 15 years. It's only just now coming to fruition, but to find out where it's going, we need to start talking about where it's coming from. So where we need to start, and everybody's going to love me for this, is Adorno! Adorno! I heart Adorno, Teddy Adorno. So everybody knows who
Teddy? Can you give a quick introduction? Because I saw a lot of blank faces. A lot of people don't seem to know why we hate Adorno.
Theodore Adorno is a German-American philosopher. He was a German, became an American citizen during the Nazi regime. In the 1930s, he immigrated to the United States, became an American citizen in the 1940s, and the next year, after the war was over, went back to Germany and lived there the rest of his life. But he was half Catholic, half Jewish, so he was Jewish heritage. And he was a philosopher, academic, musician, composer. He studied with, who was it he studied with? I'm trying to remember. He studied with one of the big, 12-tone people and all that sort of fun stuff. Yeah, he studied with Schoenberg, and he studied with a whole bunch of other people. And, anyway, so he was, and he came up with some, well, he's German, and he was writing in English, so he was writing these big, long sentences that don't make any sense.
I agree.
Each word is a concept and that sort of thing. While he was in the United States, he was actually living in Hollywood, and he was very out of place in Hollywood, very out of place in the United States in general. He came from traditional European societies. There's a hierarchy in society. That's where he's coming from, and then he shows up in Hollywood, and it's not like that at all. And so he had already started coming up with different theories in regards to society, culture, music, and cultural values and that sort of thing. So one of the things he came up with in the 1950s, after he had returned to Europe, with a guy by the name of Max Horkheimer, he wrote this very long series of essays, 4 essays, called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And one of those essays, the seminal essay, the one that everybody reads and everybody hates Adorno for, is the culture industry. So the culture industry is a layout of, it's a self-perpetuating industry that capitalizes on objects of cultural value, products that were created without material or monetary value, and then using them for material and monetary value. The theory of the culture industry is actually the theory of an industry. It is an industry, it is self-perpetuating, and it kind of builds upon itself. And so the idea of the culture industry, for example, you would go to a film, and in the film there's a certain lifestyle that's depicted, and along with a certain lifestyle there's a soundtrack. And so you are consuming a cultural good, and then through the consumption of this cultural good, you want to buy that soundtrack. And in buying that soundtrack for that film, you are then buying into that lifestyle, and it self-perpetuates. And it's just an ever-feeding cycle, the culture industry. For example, breakfast at Tiffany's. Right? Breakfast is a perfect example of the culture industry. It's just feeding on one cultural value, objects, and just going from there. So he argues that the culture industry hides behind the guise of entertainment, and through hiding itself, it effectively strips the consumer of his or her subjectivity. So we lose control over our decisions of what we're going to consume with culture. It's going to get more interesting, I promise. And through the consumption of the culture industry. You have to remember, this is the 1940s, 1950s. This is before the world that we live in now. So they weren't talking about television. They were talking about film for the most part. And they were talking about classical music. But an extension of this now, when we look at it, the consumption of television and television advertising, television is passive. Unlike film, where you go to a film, hi guys! Unlike film, where you walk into a film and you turn off the lights and you sit in a room and you focus on the film and you immerse yourself in the world of the film. What actually happens with television, was, when it was designed in the 1950s, it was designed and this is really sexist, but it's true, so as not to distract housewives from their housely duties. So women were in the home, and their fear was, if the television became a mini cinema, women wouldn't do the housework. And so television programming was specifically designed to have interruptions, advertising. And this is where the culture industry, there's this really interesting play of, do advertisements interrupt the programming, or does programming interrupt the advertisements? And there are different theories as to which is which. But television has this reciprocal relationship that is, you can't divorce TV from advertising. You just can't. And so, because television is passive by nature, it's designed to be passive, it's on in the background while you're vacuuming or cooking dinner for your husband or whatever it is that you're doing. So the consumption of television advertising is already a passive activity by design, and this allows advertising to utilize the power of the culture industry to the max. So it maximizes on the culture industry, and it really kind of takes those elements of the culture industry and really just capitalizes on it. That's it for Adorno. Yay! But television has an effect on the consumer subjectivity as well. So it's the consumer subjectivity through television, also affected by the culture industry, that sort of thing. So television and advertising has been left relatively ignored until quite recently. The idea of music and television advertising. There's always been talk of music in film and music in TV. Claudia, what's her face? I can picture her. Claudia Gordman, and her essay, or her book, The Unheard Melodies, and she talks about film music. And in the early 1980s, really one of the first texts talking about film and film music and that sort of thing. So, but it was really the 1990s before anybody had really looked at television music advertising and that sort of thing. So even though radio wasn't ignored and music on radio wasn't ignored, music on TV advertising was. David Huron, who's actually from Alberta, he's from High Prairie, Alberta. He's currently a professor in Ohio, but he was the head of the music department at Waterloo. In 1989, he wrote an essay called Music and Advertising, an Analytical Paradigm. And this is the first English language article that addresses television advertising music. So what he does is he lays out 6 elements of what he calls effective advertising music. These elements are entertainment, structure, memorability, lyrical language, targeting, and authority establishment. So Huron's conclusion in this essay is that ultimately the more elements that are used, the more effective the music is in the advertising itself. And this is really important when it comes to television jingles. You can only think of, an effective television jingle is going to encompass all 6 of these things, right? The next person who wrote a book, the first book about that included television music in English was by Nicholas Cook. He's a theory professor at Oxford. He's in the UK. And it's analyzing musical multimedia. So it comes out about 10 years after Huron's book. And what he does is he really takes on an enormous just genre. He talks about analyzing musical multimedia. And the book is like 140 pages long. So, I mean, he definitely glosses over some stuff, but he draws out a really good overview and introduction to an analysis of all musical multimedia. So he talks about film, television, radio, music videos, he talks about advertising, but he really he scratches the surface and really lays the foundation for something that could become more. But a lot of the focus is on the effects of the music on the image, what the music does to the image, and not the other way around. And this becomes a trend in the way we talk about music and advertising. Retrospectively, looking back at it, 1998, right on the cusp of all these things that we take for granted now in technology. So internet and Google and eBay and DVDs, high definition still wasn't, mass produced. It had been invented, but it still wasn't something you could get in your home. YouTube was 2006. So when we look at these things, MPEG-2 and MPEG-4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Cook really kind of gets the short end of the stick, because had he written this book 5 years later, he would have had maybe 1,000 more pages to that 124-page book. Just prior to Cook's book is a doctoral dissertation by Craig Springer. It's called Society's Soundtrack, Musical Persuasion in Television Advertising. So he has a musical communications doctoral dissertation, and what he does is he takes a very, very different approach to analyzing music multimedia. And he actually, rather than taking the musical object, or the media object, and breaking it down into its parts, and then analyzing it from the outside in, what he suggests is breaking it down into its parts, ignoring the overall structure, ignoring the big picture, look at all the little bits and pieces, and then build up from there. So it's a very difficult sort of thing to do, especially as a musicologist or a theorist, because we're trained to start from the object and work our way in. And he's suggesting that we ignore the object and start from the bottom and work our way out. So it's rhetorical theory. It's kind of it's like a 400-page document, but it investigates how music can assist marketing through persuasive communication by choosing the right bits and pieces. He puts together this method called the CAMP method: context, audience expectations, artist image, music, and production. So what he says is you need to look at all the levels of context. Then you look at all the audience expectations. Then you look at all of the artist images and all of the image of the music production, that sort of thing. So he looks at all these little things, and then after you've done hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of analysis there, then you come up to an overall conclusion for the product or the musical multimedia that you have in front of you. One of the things that's interesting about Springer is that he argues that classical music, or music that has a demonstrated significance, meaning, or storied history, is not used in advertising for any specific reason. He says it's used to create a specific mood